an amazing insight into the drivers, the catalysts for the kind of actions that you guys are taking, but also then some very real insight into the tensions that play off between the existing book, the future book, the time horizons that one has to look at, and the number of people that need to be involved if one is looking at the kind of engagement that you are talking about with clients and other stakeholders. So I think that's a sort of cautionary note about just how extensive and how ongoing your outreach to stakeholders has to be. Thank you once again. We really, really appreciate your time. We're going to go into a period of discussion here, and I see people are a little bit shy to raise questions. So I'm going to take a liberty and raise the first question. Ash, you have been responding in the chat box to Sarah's question about public versus selective disclosure. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit more to what is going through the thinking in the Prudential Authority around the value of disclosures that may not be public versus the value of public disclosures. Ash, are you still with us? Okay, we'll come back.
I don't see him currently in the list of participants, Karin.
He did indicate he would have to disappear briefly at some point, so we'll come back to that. But I think that, you know, perhaps an insight from the paper is the intention is to coordinate disclosures, so that disclosures that are made public and disclosures that go into the regulatory filings are not substantially different, because the risk for the authorities dealing with financial stability is that they need to separate out sanitized public disclosure, if I can call it that way, to what is coming in. They need to have a clear understanding of the value of it. So I'm going to turn to Sarah and ask you, Sarah, if you could pick up on one or two points that you made, and perhaps give us a little bit more insight into the taxonomy working group, where it is at the moment, and what the next steps are likely to be in terms of developing and adopting that taxonomy for the financial sector.
Sure, thanks, Karin. Yeah, the taxonomy working group has really kicked off quite well, and we have appointed Carbon Trust, who were initially a UK-based organisation, and therefore they have a lot of links with the work that's been done in the EU. So what we have developed at this stage is what we're calling a draft zero taxonomy, and that's looking at the different sectors and the objectives and thresholds for each of those sectors. And we went on then a stakeholder consultation to get inputs on our approach. What we still need to do then is to go kind of into sector experts to understand whether those thresholds that have been adopted or adapted from the EU are applicable, and transitional activities we may or may not want to include, given that we don't have a clear kind of just transition plan for South Africa. We are hoping part of the process is also to develop a governance mechanism, understanding that a taxonomy will evolve and change over time. So you need to have an understood kind of governance mechanisms for when it may be revised. So we're hoping to have the first draft of the taxonomy in about June next year. We're going to produce what we have now is a zero draft. We're going to produce a beta draft, which we're going to test in some financial institutions as well as DFIs in the new year, and then develop what we're calling a first draft taxonomy by about May or June. And maybe just to add, we're focusing on the green aspects of a taxonomy, but we have also been requested to consider developing a negative list, or what's been known as a brown taxonomy. So we're still kind of going to see how the green taxonomy pans out, and whether we need to have a negative list, because a green taxonomy is a positive list, and also potentially a social or SDG taxonomy. There's also been a lot of work being done on that. Thanks.
Fantastic, thanks, Sarah. Gert, if I can turn to you and maybe put you on the spot a little bit. We know that the leading banks in South Africa, or the big banks in South Africa, have all developed coal financing policies of various kinds, and they nuance those policies, which I think is an important aspect of addressing, as you talked about, the environmental and the social together, with a sort of existing versus new differentiation in most of the policies. Could you talk to us a little bit about what that meant, and then also expand a little bit, if you don't mind, on the issue of the time horizon, that issue of the maturity of the book versus a climate change time horizon, where some people are looking for sort of scenarios that reach beyond 2040. So if you can talk to those two aspects and just give us a little bit more insight, please.
Sure. On the coal side, the important side point is that we don't want to create systemic risks. If we took an extreme view on coal and cut off financing, we would not be able to do this video conference today because there will be no energy. And as a consequence of that, you essentially need to take the view that you need to preserve the funding that is in the market at present, hence the existing book starting point, so that we as a country can continue to operate. Then you need to take a view to say, what do we require in order to continue to operate that will take us via a transitional phase? Now, in part, we're dependent on government's energy plans and the speed that government also is looking in terms of energy plan. In part, we dependent also on corporate South Africa in terms of how fast they want to transition. But you need to take a view that there are certainly a necessity to keep on financing in certain areas. It's also something that you distinguish between what is general working capital finance and what is project finance. And generally, you will see that it is easy to isolate areas that are higher pressure areas, like say new coal-fired power stations, is something that most banks are highly reluctant to finance in the current environment. But to say that you finance the rehabilitation of a coal mine, I think there's a lot more defendable, or that you are financing the changing of ownership of one coal mine to another coal mine, that's still coal industry and would reflect in your TCFD disclosure as coal-related financing. That is, of course, a lot more defendable. Striking the right balance is extremely difficult, and it's one of those areas where everyone is disappointed. The coal industry is disappointed. Other stakeholders might be disappointed that you curtail some of the activities, and if you are looking for transitional environmental change, you are disappointed to say that the banks are not aggressive enough. And it's something that one regularly need to revisit. I think we've all got a stake in the ground that doesn't look all too different between the different banks, but it's something that we need to revisit going forward. As I say, we are dependent here on a lot of external factors in terms of how this moves across the country. It's not the same as saying you are an equity investor and you invest or you don't invest. So like a portfolio investor, where there's no consequence if they don't invest. With us, there's a direct consequence when you pull back bank financing. So that is how we look at it. But suffice to say, we are acutely aware of the difficulty of navigating these various areas, and the need to not conduct business as usual. So I think that's probably in a nutshell how we are managing the coal side. If I can talk briefly about time horizons, it was interesting for me recently on a call with the International Association of Credit Portfolio Managers. We've had a grouping of people all involved with credit portfolios, but that range from the reinsurers to the investment banks. Now, the reinsurers have got long tail exposures of 50-year plus. And when they looked at quantifying risk, they were mostly interested in finding out what the temperature is going to be in 2050. And that's where the focus has been, and rightly so, because they've got exposures that they're managing right now that is 50-year plus exposures, if you talk about the large international reinsurers. On the other side, you've had, say, the investment banks that's dealing in liquid assets, and of note for them is what the ways that financial markets price risk differently right now, and how much that can differ from day to day, week to week. So you've got a time horizon ranging from intraday to end of day and movements to that up to 50 years. You've got the commercial banks like ourselves that is arguably more interested in what is the extent of climate risk that we are faced with right now, given our view on the assets that we've got right now in terms of regulatory changes that is expected over the horizon that you've got an asset, in particular for our coal assets. That is of course very, very important. We need to understand and take a view in terms of how much is regulations going to change, how much is supply and demand going to change. And the most logical time horizon is the time horizon of your in-force book, is to spend, in my view, the most time on. Now, for a commercial bank such as ours, that would be a 4 to 5 year time span. But as I've noted, the financial markets transmits those impacts in immediately. So whenever you are dealing in an environment where there's market prices, they are actually transmitting the future state in right now. And in other words, even though you say you look at a 3 to 4 year horizon, you are also spending time with the long-term areas. Now, we could quantify theoretically 30 to 40 year impacts, but it is extremely difficult to know even in which markets we will be active by then. And as a consequence, the accuracy of your forecast quickly can become very spurious accuracy, because it's not something that you are really managing. It is a hypothetical risk, versus if you sat with those long-dated, long-tail risks, it's got a very different notion. Invariably, I think you need to focus across all the time horizons, but depending on the nature of your organization, you need to focus on a specific horizon which is relevant for you. If you contrast this to, say, an energy company in the country that has to replace a plant, clearly their horizon is going to be very different to somebody operating in the financial markets, where we need to decide what type of loans do we give. So I think there's not a one-size-fits-all horizon. There is particular horizons particularly relevant for particular organizations. And that's largely the way that we look at it.
Thank you so much, Gert. I see we do have a couple of questions that are coming through on the chat line, as well as from participants. Just to respond, there was a question about disclosure and regulatory versus mandatory. Tisha, I think you should know that our bureaucracies never indicate in advance when disclosures are going to become mandatory. But I will highlight the fact that during the early discussion phases of this paper, the industry participants themselves indicated a preference for some regulation. So not specifically with regard to disclosure, but there is certainly a preference indicated for some form of minimum disclosure. And in the work of the TCFD, the Disclosure Working Group, we are focusing on what constitutes disclosure, what constitutes minimum disclosure. As Gert indicated in his presentation, and others have indicated, including Sarah, there are a range of models. There are companies or financial institutions doing standalone reporting. There are others that have been, like FirstRand, that have incorporated it fully into their integrated annual report and their sustainability reporting. But so it's less about the format than about the substance that we're looking at in terms of principles for minimum disclosure. But I think we did have a couple of questions. Lizette
Karin, there's
Stein.
also a hand
Yes,
up. I don't know if it's
Lizette Stein from Nedbank had her hand up. Lizette, are you still?
Yes, Karin, thank you. So my question was actually not a question, it's just reflection. So Gert, firstly, I just want to say thank you for sharing. It was very insightful. And I agree with you. This is a journey that we cannot do alone. We have to do it together. So just around the time horizons, so from a financial market point of view, I understand it sometimes go in when they calculate the PV, it gets to a longer span. But for example, if you look at the oil and gas, a gas facility right now, we start building, let's say next year. The facility of the project finance might span over 20 years, which will take us to 2040. So just any views on that type of scenario where it gets a bit longer than the natural 4 to 5 years from your side, Gert?
So I think what you need to look at is the behavioral maturity of the asset. Say if you look at long dated assets such as home loans or commercial mortgages, while the contractual maturity might be 20 years, the behavioral maturity might be 4 or 5 years. In the oil and gas space, it's slightly different. Different people have got different approaches towards that. It depends really whether you intend holding the asset for 20 years or whether you are bridging it post a construction period and then selling it off, or it gets refinanced. The refinancing is very common after construction periods, and as a consequence, again, the behavioral maturity of those exposures are much shorter than that 20 or 30 years that the contract is, because the sponsors typically refinance after certain major events, and that is why I say that how we look at that is it's typically 6 to 7 years behavioral maturity on those exposures until you get refinancing. However, there are on the odd occasion long dated assets in that sector specifically, and then you do need to do the additional due diligence work, but then it's on a very specific asset type, where you then look at very specific transition risks and very specific physical risks. And if you have to do that on a handful of assets, then it becomes workable, especially when you involve external specialists. But if you have to do it across a portfolio, across many different exposures, it can become very, very complex. But one should appreciate that there are instances where you need to do the work under the long dated. As a proportion of your balance sheet is unlikely to be material, but you still need to do some of the work there.
Thanks so much, Gert. There was another hand up, but I see it's disappeared. Did you pick up a hand, Ben?
There's a Neva, Karin. I'm not sure if there's still a question. Now it's gone.
Oh, okay. Okay. So I think we do have a number of questions that have been dealt with in the chat line. Sarah has dealt with a couple of issues. Ben, have you picked up anything that I haven't picked up?
No, I think Pierre had a question around the transition taxonomy. Sarah answered and said that the initial taxonomy will be a draft green taxonomy, and then further taxonomies will look to be developed. There was another question around liability, which I think Sarah also answered. I don't know, Sarah, if you want to expand on that further.
I think there's another question. So Sarah, if you feel that you've responded to that, there's another question that's probably quite important to get in. Maria has spoken about risk maps. There are indeed some risk maps available. However, there's a work at a granular level, which Gert has referred to and others have referred to, that will require individual institutions to either contract in specialists or do their own work on the absolute granular level, because I think we all would understand that if we say there's going to be a flood or a fire risk, and let's not forget the fires in the Knysna area a couple of years ago, but if you're talking flood risk, you can't say Johannesburg has a flood risk, because certain areas of Johannesburg would be at far greater risk of flooding than others. But yes, Maria, there are within the climate science faculties at various universities and within the CSIR, as well as the Weather Bureau, there certainly are weather maps and risk maps that can at least facilitate some of that thinking. Sarah, sorry, if you want to come in on transition taxonomies, I think that Sarah has indicated that we'll start with the green taxonomy and move on from there. Okay, are there any more questions? I don't see any more. I think we've covered most of the questions. Ben, in the interests of time and letting people go, can we put up the sort of final slides?
Sure thing, Karin. There are a few questions about availability of presentations. We will send the presentations and the recording of this webinar to everybody in the next few days. We'll also send a quick survey out to help us understand what we can do in follow-up sessions. So
Sarah highlighted the website that is being driven to support this program, so we'll put the link to that, sustainablefinanceinitiative.org.za. So in wrap up, thank you very much to everybody for participating. I know it's been a long session at the end of a challenging year, but we've seen the need. We've been told there is a need to build capacity and competency, not only within the private sector, but across the regulatory sector. So just so you know, we will be working with the Reserve Bank Academy and others to build regulatory capacity over the next while as well. In the capacity and competency working group have determined a program of webinars that will be held every second month, starting from this one and then at the end of February in 2021. The various themes that will be covered are the TCFD, the business case scenario modeling and analysis, stakeholder engagement, sustainable financing, green taxonomy and case studies, not necessarily in that order. We will take forward these things as the availability of speakers and the challenges get expressed. I see Aniva's question popped up. When can we expect to see further communication from the Pact? Aniva, we'll get back to you on that. Ash had to leave the session, unfortunately. He was called to another meeting. The session has been recorded. We will make that available via the Sustainable Finance Initiative website. And with that, thank you again to the speakers. Sarah, as always, for her leadership and the overview from the perspective of Treasury, Ash from the perspective of the Prudential Authority, and of course Gert Kruger from FirstRand, indicating the sort of leadership that they are taking and the difficult challenges that they are addressing, and the need. I think a couple of important points for me that stood out. the need for senior executive support and leadership and championship, but also the need to think beyond a core expert team within the organization, which they do have, but to think to frontline people, to think across the industries that they serve, and to think that around customers. I would much have liked to probe the issue of how clients and customers are reacting, but we've run out of time. So with that, thank you very much. I think we need to close the session. Thank you again to Ben and the IFC team. Thank you to BASA for their help. And thank you, of course, to the participants. Hope you have found this useful. Ben has indicated that you will get a follow-up survey. If you can fill that in, it really helps us to make sure that we address the needs of various stakeholders. So thank you. And with that, we'll close the session.
Thank you. Cheers, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.